3 years ago, I released a video showcasing what I called my next-gen Skyrim mod list, which unfortunately became a bit borked because of the Anniversary Edition update being incompatible with some of those mods at its release. But since then, the Skyrim modding scene has updated just about everything that was affected, and it's seen much more innovation since then. As we move into Skyrim's 13th year since its initial release, I thought I'd take another crack at making a mod list. And who knows, maybe this could be the first of many similar videos. I know it's a common sentiment in the modding scene, but building a mod list and testing it out is much more fun than actually playing Skyrim sometimes. And I really enjoyed putting this one together. Today's video has a very different goal from my older mod list. While that one was over 100 mods long, covering gameplay, quests, locations, and more, this one is a much more restrained list, coming in at around 30 mods in total, and that's including all required mods, tools, and utilities, many of which you'll likely be using anyway. The focus here is much more on visuals, making use of some mods that affected multiple parts of the game, rather than downloading 100 different mods, each one changing only one model or one texture. For me, this is probably the most drastically different that I've ever made my game look. But I'm also not someone who wants to make it look super photorealistic. It's still obviously Skyrim, which is always one of the goals for me. But changing some of the core models and textures goes a long way in establishing a new look and feel. And between the lighting, foliage, and trees that I picked out for today's video, the look and feel actually kind of reminds me a bit of some of the Skyblivion previews, which, no complaints here. I love how Skyblivion is coming along. This mod list was built on a copy of Anniversary Edition, with every single last piece of the Anniversary upgrade installed. Because of that, Mod Organizer lists this at around 100 plugins in total, across the base game, official DLCs, the Creation Club content, and the mods that I installed for this video. This mod list, being focused on graphics first and foremost, should still be compatible should you not own the Anniversary upgrade. And even if you're not on the most up-to-date version of Skyrim, even if you're still on the older 1.5.97 version of the game, you should still be fine to use just about all of these mods. Maybe with the exception of the alternate start mod that I use, since they unfortunately don't make the older versions of the mod easily accessible. And before I get into the specific mods themselves, let me just add that this video has no color grading, no color correction, no touch-ups in post to make it look better than it did on screen. Although I'm still at the mercy of the YouTube compression, hoping that it doesn't absolutely destroy the video quality. So, fingers crossed. First things first, let's talk about some of our basics. For this, I'm using Cathedral Weathers and the corresponding culminated ENB preset. While Cathedral isn't the newest weather mod out there, it's still one of my favorites. Having used it for my most recent modded playthrough, even by the end of that series, nearly 2 years after it began, there were still moments where I was blown away by the beauty that it added to the game. Culminated ENB was inspired by several other popular ENB presets, and it has options for Cathedral, Obsidian, and Azurite weathers. Each of these downloads also comes with different quality options, in case you're a bit more worried about a hit to your performance. For this video, I'm using the full quality version, and I maintained a solid 60 FPS overall. Using these two in conjunction gave the game a really vibrant environment while it was sunny, and some really desolate, darker vibes in gray and stormy weather, creating a really nice contrast. We've got a few mods that touch upon the landscapes and environments, the first of which being Fantasia Landscapes by Sky King, which adds new, high-quality textures for mountains, dirt and cliffs, glaciers and caves, rivers, coasts, quarries, bridges, roads, and much more. While Fantasia works perfectly fine on its own, it is suggested that you use a handful of other mods alongside it. Of these recommendations, I'm using Enhanced Rocks and Mountains and Sky King's Skyland all-in-one. Granted, during the installation process for Skyland, I didn't choose to use absolutely everything. In my case, I opted to use all of the new city textures for Riften, Markarth, Solitude, Windhelm, Winterhold, and Whiterun, as well as textures for the Orc Longhouses, Skyrim's farmhouses, road signs, and Imperial forts. However, I didn't use the new landscape textures since I was already using Fantasia. Fortunately, the detailed FOMod installer for Skyland All-in-One makes it easy to pick and choose exactly what you want. Skyland also comes in at the largest mod in today's video, with the standard 2K resolution pack clocking in at 6.5 gigs. But given how much it changes the game, it might even be the only texture mod that you need. To me, Skyland has a slightly different feel from some of the original game's design, but it still fits really well. Vanilla Skyrim feels a bit more drab at times, which I think is meant to reflect the harsh climate and the more simplistic lifestyle of the local Nords. But Skyland aims to make the cities look a little bit more sophisticated, if you will. This combination of Skyland with cathedral weathers and culminated EMB really comes together to create something that reminds me ever so slightly of Oblivion. For this list, I'm also using Nature of the Wildlands to add new plants and trees. To me, this is a single mod that goes a long way to make the game feel new. After looking at the original trees for years and years, you'd be surprised how much heavy lifting a tree mod does all on its own. To complement this, I'm also using Folkvanger, a grass overhaul. This gives Skyrim a much more filled-in look. This really helps to establish a new identity for Skyrim's wilds, with more unique tree models across the different holds, more vibrant and higher quality grass. And it can help to bring your Skyrim into the modern age. At first, I was gonna see how it looked without a new grass mod, and I immediately hated how the vanilla grass looked alongside everything else. But your mileage may vary. For water, I'm using Cathedral Water Overhaul and Fixes, paired with Simplicity of Sea, which also includes ENB compatible displacement maps. This was a new one for me, as I had only ever really used Realistic Water 2 before, but I think this is definitely going to be my new go-to moving forward. Adding on to landscapes and environments, I'm using Rudy's Nordic Ruins SE. I really wanted some of the architecture across the game to stand out a bit more, and I really liked Rudy's Nordic Ruins in particular, which helped to make these structures look more worn and weathered, with much more detailed textures than we would have had in the base game alone. As I mentioned before, within Skyland All-in-One, I opted to use its road signs and forts, which helps to transform the road signs, making them a much more lovely sight as you travel between the major cities. On a similar note, I also downloaded Sky King signs, since the original vanilla signs kinda clash when they're up against the rest of Skyland's newly textured architecture. And on the note of more specific mods that improve smaller bits of the world, I also decided to upgrade the standing stones, courtesy of Menhir, Standing Stones of Skyrim. I love how different these look compared to their vanilla counterparts. The new models and textures make them feel much more natural, almost. And they kinda remind me of the standing stones as they appear in the Elder Scrolls Online. In what will probably come as a bit of a surprise, I opted not to focus on city mods for this video, so Skyland's textures serve as the only real touch-up for this set of mods today. However, I think it would be worth coming back to this at a later time, and maybe making a separate video focused exclusively on some of the best city overhauls and additions out there. So let me know what you think. But taking a look at Skyland's changes to the cities, I have to say, I really love it. Markarth has much more greenery and moss in its stone, making it feel as though nature has really tried to retake the ruins. This, combined with the much more polished brass accents, makes for a more colorful city. The new trees from Nature of the Wildlands also help to make the space feel a bit more filled in, giving it even more of that overgrown look. Solitude feels much more elegant across the board, from the docks down below to the city's approach and outer walls, with ivy having spread across the arch connecting to the Solitude windmill, bringing just a bit more greenery to the scene. All in all, the city feels much more elegant, which is only fitting for Skyrim's capital. Whiterun and its hold have always been one of my favorites in the game, but the city itself didn't feel all that much different with this particular set of mods installed, which is perfectly fine by me. But what I really loved was how the rest of the hold looked. Taking a look at the surrounding farms, we're adding another mod. This being Ours Windmills by Ray84. This wasn't something I had initially planned on upgrading, but as I walked around and looked at different models and textures, I couldn't help but feel that the windmills in particular needed a new coat of paint. The path leading from Whiterun to Riverwood is beautiful, with its denser grass and new foliage. The village itself is equally stunning, and is elevated by another of the mods on our list, High Poly Project by Lucid APs. This replaces the original meshes for several items in-game, including firewood piles and chopping blocks, as well as the short stone walls. Much like Skyland All-in-One, it comes with a detailed FO mod menu, so you can choose exactly what you want. And I went with Embers XD, just to make some fire effects look a lot nicer. The final one of Skyrim cities with its own unique architecture is Riften, getting much more detail along its stonework. My favorite part of the city has to be the canals, between the lighting, weather, and water textures. The surrounding region really benefits from this selection of mods, and I've always loved the vibrant autumn feel that the Rift has. It really stands out, and if anything, it's what I remember the area looking like back when I first played Skyrim in 2011. And while the other cities don't really have their own unique architecture, they still benefit from these mods, as the textures for the farmhouses are included in Skyland All-in-One. And in the case of Winterhold, the college gets new textures across the board, giving the stone bricks in particular much more defined edges. For those who might not be in the know by now, SMIM is a staple in just about every mod list for me. Short for Static Mesh Improvement Mod, SMIM has been around for a very long time. And unlike many of the other old guard mods, it really doesn't have a more contemporary all-in-one replacement. I truly think that SMIM is one of the best bang for your buck mods, covering so many different models and textures across the game in a single download, improving the models for a lot of the static items across the game, from clutter, furniture, and more. Jagged logs become much more round and smooth, ropes get a much higher poly count. So much of the game gets a facelift with this one mod, and I've become so used to it now that I'd probably be a bit thrown off if I were playing Skyrim without it. It gives so many items much more depth and detail, and with Skyrim being as old as it is, SMIM helps to make it look a bit more modern. And finally, for NPCs, I kept things fairly simple. Cathedral Player and NPC Overhaul, which retextures and remodels NPCs across the game, from humans, beastfolk, and elves, which will also affect you, the player, as well. There's countless NPC overhauls out there, and over the years I've fooled around with a handful of them. This is one that I like given that it still aims for a style that's reminiscent of Skyrim's original look. And keeping in line with that philosophy, I also went with high poly vanilla hair, smoothing out meshes and improving the details across many of the vanilla hairstyles. In my previous mod list, I opted for Waiko, Windsong Immersive Character Overhaul, and I still love the look of it. But in my 2-year-long modded playthrough, I ultimately found a couple very specific bugs with it, most notably that it would edit several NPCs to be protected, which had the potential to create issues with specific quests. That's really not something a mod aimed at improving NPC appearances should be touching. So I unfortunately can't really recommend it anymore. And while it's not technically an NPC mod, it's something that I consider to be adjacent. Rustic Clothing by Gamwitch, since it felt a bit weird having improved NPC textures but still being adorned in lower res clothing. And similarly, I went with a Midian-born Book of Silence, which improves the textures for armors, weapons, and a few unique items, such as the Dragon Priest masks. Since today's video was meant as a smaller mod list, I opted for a Midian-born since it works as a decent all-in-one. However, I would also really recommend Zavbio's armory textures. They've released individual downloads for most armor sets, including Iron, Ebony, Elven, Orcish, and so on. as well as some great retextures for modded armors, including immersive armors and vigilant. And I would love if Zavio maybe had an all-in-one version just for convenience sake. But like I said, this was really intended to be a smaller, more focused mod list. And each mod really does a lot of work on its own to improve Skyrim's visuals. Even the smaller, more specific mods are meant to help bring a bit more life and style to the game. And it really goes to show you just how much you can do even with just a handful of mods. There's not a lot of requirements needed to get this mod list running. Just some of the basics that you'll likely need anyway: Skyrim script extender, SkyUI, MCM helper, the ENB primary files, ENB helper, and address library. As part of my testing and setup for today's video, I did need the unofficial patch and Live Another Life. Because frankly, having tried out a few alternate start mods, I still consider Live Another Life to be my personal favorite. But this was mainly because I didn't want to have to go through Helgen to test out my mods again and again. Like I said earlier though, this is where you might run into issues if you're on an older version of the game. There are of course alternatives to Live Another Life should you be in that situation. And if you're not worried about having an alternate start mod, then this whole point is moot anyway. Things like Culminated EMB and Cathedral Weathers can easily be swapped out for your own preferences. And the rest of the mods in this list would still work just fine alongside them. But for me, Cathedral and Culminated were the exact combination that I was looking for this list. But obviously, you might be looking for something different. Maybe you want something less vibrant and a bit more muted. Or maybe you want something that's even more saturated. There's no shortage of good ENB presets out there, and that alone can help to define the overall tone of your game. And one thing I'd like to finally fool around with is maybe moving away from ENB altogether, and maybe try out community shaders instead. And I'm including my PC specs on screen, which are at least a little bit upgraded since my previous mod list back in 2021, with the main difference since then being a graphics card upgrade. And frankly, I'm hoping that this GPU lasts me for years to come. Think of today's video as a good baseline that you can get started with, and add onto as you go. By not focusing on gameplay additions, locations, and quests, this is already fairly open in terms of compatibility. And while this might not be the exact mod list that I use for all of my Skyrim videos moving forward, I thought this would be a fun little exercise in modding. As it is, I have a few other ideas for smaller, more specific mod lists, just as a way of showing different themed lists as a sort. Like I said earlier, maybe a video specifically for city overhauls and additions, a more gameplay focused lists, winter overhauls, stuff like that. But that's gonna be all for today. As always, thank you for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.